Okay, everybody. Welcome back from your hard-earned break, and now it's the time to toil and worry and study and do all those things that are what we normally do. So today we're going to continue with the course, and we're going to do Sex, Bodies, and Intimacy. It's called in your reading list. And before we do that, I do want to continue on with a discussion we had at the end of the last lecture, because I think it's quite important for the course. And so it will lay the groundwork for a lot of the things that are coming forward as we move increasingly from the micro level through the middle level, or what we sometimes call the meso level, up to the macro level, which is how the course continues on toward its end. So this idea of structuration, which is what I talked about at the close of business last time before your vacation, is the idea that we're going to return to today. I'm going to spend a little time with it, and then we'll move into the issues of sexuality and the body, which we'll spend the rest of the week on. So, as I said last time, one of the things that we confront as social scientists, but also just, I think, as thinking human beings, is this problem of determinism versus free will, as the philosophers sometimes refer to it as. But we sociologists really get into it because of the fact that so much of what we do has a deterministic quality. In fact, in a way, what you could say all of sociology does is explain how it is that people have no choice, that we discover that people born of a certain social class, born in a certain gender, born of a certain race, have structures that impose force on them, that constrain what they can become and what they do. And in fact, a whole lot of the course so far, starting with our very first meeting, which was talking about how it is that we came to be at NYU together, how other people come to be at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, and still other people are at the state colleges and community colleges. How is it that that all works? And that what human beings want and what human beings have in their inner power has only something to do with it, maybe. But we sociologists can show that it has to do with other factors that are external to the human being. How far can we go with that? If we keep pushing that idea, then what is left of each of us as a willing creature? And we all experience that will, that determination, the choice-making that we do a whole lot in life. So how can we reconcile this notion that we're just billiard balls on the table that are being bounced around by these external forces with what we experience all the time in our daily lives as something resembling what we take to be a free will? We at least feel the choices that we make and imagine that we can do something about them. Between these two extremes, there must be some middle ground. And that's what we're exploring in today's class, as indeed last time. Between this idea that we're merely billiard balls being pushed by external forces, lint or feathers in the wind, versus the idea that everything we do comes out of our own wishes, our own wills, 24/7, and there isn't any doubt about it. Between that, there must be some kind of way of talking about it, some sort of solution to that problem. In the context of the discussion last time about gender, a woman can be, at one extreme, anything she wants. Just, hear me now, I am woman. And I can be president of the United States. I can be a great scientist. After all, there was Marie Curie. She was a great scientist. But there have been no U.S. presidents still. Came close last time around. And indeed, there are very few scientists. And so gender must have something going on that both allows volition and change and human beings to negotiate paths that other people have not negotiated before, yet at the same time, there's something going on that constrains people by virtue of their gender and moves them in one direction as opposed to the other. Okay, so sociologists call it the problem of structure versus the problem of agency. And how can we understand structure and agency? Well, often it's spoken of as structure versus agency. And indeed, that's the way I've set it up today, structure versus agency. The one route to the solution is to start saying, no, it's structure and agency, that somehow both count. But the stronger argument, and the one that I'm going to foist on you today, continuing from last time, is that no, it's not structure and agency even. It's rather, there is no such thing as structure and agency. It is a single thing together. The binary, we sometimes call it, needs to be eliminated. And we need to think of structure and agency as constituting one another, as being part of the same process of structuration, that there is structurating that goes on that results in an amalgam of structure and agency, and that amalgam is the real world. It's life as we know it, and it's the way life works. So here is a rather homely example of structure and agency at work. And I assume that, can everybody see that on this lawn at a university, it happens to be, you see that, I know you don't go to universities with lawns, but some people do. And you see that line, can everybody see it in the back row? Back row, you can see it. Okay, so what's happened here is that institutions like universities, when they're built, they lay out how we're supposed to walk. And they pour concrete to determine how it is that people are going to walk. And those paths are literally set in concrete. And an enormous number of people use them. But it's also the case that despite what are sometimes signs or policies that say don't walk on the grass, people do walk on the grass. And in this case, you can see that there is the beginning of a path that's obviously comes from somewhere and connects to that other path that's coming off near where that fire hydrant is, and then toward the entrance to that building. So somebody got the idea that I'm not going to use the path that's been laid out for me. I'm going to create a new path. And it's more than one person, because if only one person indeed chose that shortcut, then we wouldn't see it. There would be some bent grass, but it would recover in, I don't know how long bent grass takes to recover. Is it an hour? Is it 10 minutes? Is it a day? But it doesn't take very long. So more than one person has walked along that path. The way I play it, the way I play the movie in my mind is that somebody has walked the path and bent the grass a little. If another human being within that bent grass moment comes by and sees the bent grass, then that bent grass is a kind of invitation that, remember how audiences are constituted, that someone else has chosen this shortcut. You are not alone. That's what the bent grass says. It says you are not alone. We don't have a mass movement here. We don't have an institutional policy that allows it, but you are not alone. And then, by the by, do you see that path that's coming off on a kind of an arc? That's quite a few people have taken that shortcut from one path to the other. And as more people do it, it becomes more of an inducement that you can do it. You'd be a fool not to do it. You're trying to get from point A to B. This will get you there sooner. So it can't be a law that's enforced that much, since obviously quite a few people have done it. It can't be that much of a moral evil to do it, because look at how many people have done it. And the more people that have done it, the more people do it. And so the path becomes deeper and broader over time. There's another one that's not too different. Now there's one that's created a gully-like path. And as people, now of course there's other things going on in terms of the natural world, which is that you're now creating a place for, I called it a gully, for water to run in, which is then further denuding through erosion the possibility of grass growing. And the university gardeners are probably trying to figure out exactly how do I deal with this problem without putting up fencing, which would be one of the solutions that we often see. This becomes then an even stronger pattern of walking. This is just so bad. And here, it's still a different pattern. And so there are the actual physicality of the path making varies from one instance to another. But the point I'm trying to get at is that once the process starts, it feeds on itself. And that the spontaneous actions or agency of people becomes mutually reinforcing as more people join in. And what you're doing all along is creating a structure that then structurates what the other people will do. So people create, through their agency, create a path which then structures how other people will move. We create and ourselves. So we create our paths as our paths create us. We create structures that structure us. And now that gets us to the term that's used, which is structuration, which was coined by a very much still living sociologist who I mentioned to you last time, Anthony Giddens, who, as a matter of fact, once taught this very class, Sociology 1, with me. In fact, more than once. And there he is now, as I also think I told you, Lord Giddens himself in a lighter moment. So that's the way the structuration process works. Do people have questions about that? This is a kind of important idea. And I'm hoping that I've made it clear. Because, of course, what I want you to do is to move beyond the issue of paths in the ground, which we really don't care much about. The environmentalists may care about it when it happens on a very large scale. But what I'm trying to do is lay the groundwork for thinking about all society as operating this way. All our organizations, institutions, our so-called values and norms are things that we have built that then build us. We meaning human beings over history. Some of us count for much more than others. Remember all our discussion about labeling theory and all of that. And we'll be talking about social class later in the course. But the point is that humans make it, and then what we make makes us. And it is the way in which structure and agency can be thought of as a single process, rather than things which are opposed to one another, or even things that are additions to one another. They are a single thing. So now let's, in this wonderful world of applying things, we can return to the topic of gender and how that works as an instance of structuration. So we learn from West and Zimmerman that we do gender, D-O, we do it. It's not something that's just there, it's rather something that's done. And in the doing of it, it makes it there. We create gender through our agency, but that then becomes part of the structure that then conditions the next agency and how agency works. And it happens at the most micro level, and I think I spoke of it last time. One of my favorite topics is men's rooms and women's rooms. And every time any of us chooses the, quote, right room, that those of us who are bringing off maleness in everything we are and everything we do, by the way we walk, by the fact that we men, when we take a sip of tea, well, we don't drink tea anyway, we drink coffee. When we take a sip of coffee, we don't put our little pinky up in the air. Now, do we? That would be a contrary to gender a gender move. We do gender, West and Zimmerman say, and we do it in every way there is. And returning to the example of women's rooms and men's rooms, every time we move through the world and choose that right room, a man, I'll call it a so-called man, because you know what I mean by a man, a gender display of maleness, goes through the men's room, that reasserts, reinforces, recapitulates, structures, creates a structure of gender that didn't exist before in exactly and precisely the same degree. And of course, the opposite is true for women, or the same is true for women. Every time a woman chooses that correct room, correct based on the rest of her display, she is doing the same thing. And so in and out, all over this campus, and I sound like a rock musician now, and all over this world, people are constituting gender through this simple act of choosing the right room. But of course, we also know through some of the work we've read in the course, it's also done in conversation, whether we interrupt or not, how much we speak, whether we ask for permission before we speak. Just showing that tendency is also constituting gender. The fact that we applaud at football and for football, I'm not speaking exactly at the game, but the phenomenon of football constitutes gender in a particular kind of way, as opposed to the lesser adulation, for example, for gymnastics or for figure skating, which have somewhat different publics and don't loom as large on the sports horizon. We do it when, and now we're moving toward a more macro level, when we set up and take jobs, so that we set up an occupational structure in which women, and we hire them, in which women's jobs earn less money than men's jobs. That we classify, just as we classify who goes through which door and how that's to work, we also classify doors of employment, that this is men's work and this is women's work. And massively, people participate. Both men and women participate appropriately. That is, choose the appropriate job, a nurse for a woman and a doctor for a male. That used to be the way that worked. Of course, that's changing. Taking care of babies, that's women's work. Hauling stuff around, including driving a truck, that's men's work. Science is men's work. Literature is women's work. Women, it can be thought of, women think differently than men. If you're a woman, you think literature, you don't think science. That was the idea of Lawrence Summers, who is now the head of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. He is our chief economist in the United States. And when he was president of Harvard, he proffered the idea, and he just named it as hypothesis, that the reason why there were so few women at Harvard in science, or in science generally, is that women think differently. Remember how natives think, that it's a different kind of mind, and that this different kind of mind does not lend itself to science. Well, there were mass protests, and in the much more politically correct moment in which he said those things, he was forced to resign. That wasn't the only reason. He'd offended numbers of people for numbers of reasons, but that was the critical moment that led to his being forced out of Harvard. And indeed, what people pointed out was the tremendously changing ratio of men and women, even in science. It's true today that the preponderance of scientists are males, the preponderance of science students are males, except that's not true anymore, for example, in the biological sciences and the ecological sciences, where Rachel Carson, after all, was responsible for the great breakthrough in ecological environmental science from at least one aspect and one end of it, pointing to the possibility that women can think scientifically and that has now been registered in that those ratios are changing and becoming more favorable to women. And then just one other arena which will get us closer to the other things I want to talk about today, and that is things like the kind of environment that people are in. And last time I brought up the issue of men calling out to women. Well, and the stereotype is construction crews. Hey, baby, I like your legs. But in fact, there's a whole lot of that goes on in more subtle ways that are not about construction crews, as in I like your skirt, or kidding around that men do in the workplace with women, even sometimes in settings like this one. Less and less, it's true. But this kind of sexual banter, which is oriented toward the sexuality of women, reminds women of their dependency on men, and it reinforces a certain structure that then induces certain content of action as people make their life choices. And as I spoke about last time when I talked about 6th Avenue, each encounter between a homeless man of the sort that you read about and the middle-class women who walk by, that takes that kind of form that Denier writes about in his book, reinforces the fact that women are open people in a way that men are not, that men of that sort are lower men and lower in the class structure, and reaching to the more macro level yet, that Mayor Giuliani, the law and order mayor of New York in those days, who wanted to rid the streets of vendors and other people who detract from our quality of life, that people like Mayor Giuliani, our strong Republican leader at the time, is someone who needs to be encouraged and someone that I support. So I've taken you on a tour of how it is that microstructures build mesostructures, lead then to macrostructures, like ending up with the strength of strengthening the hand of Mayor Giuliani and his campaigns across many fronts that would look different, perhaps, than they otherwise would if it wasn't built in part on these interactions that take place. Well, now, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'd like to talk about sex. If we talk about sex, we have to confront something that in the world of physiology we know about. And that is that there are two things, sort of, like male and female, sort of. There's a certain kind of plumbing that tends to be found in very large amounts between one or the other, but that we don't leave it at that. And that's where society comes in, and that's where sociology comes in. That is, we emphasize those differences and create gender roles. Gender is the sociological phenomenon. Sexuality is, we usually speak of it as the biological phenomenon. That is, we build gender on plumbing. And we do it by names, so that we name the boys different from the girls. It's not just in the US society. This is very common everywhere in the world. We do it by dress. We do it by colors and the colors we dress them in. We do it by ceremonies. Boys have bar mitzvahs and girls do not. And we do it by body manipulation and in a radical way at times. So males are circumcised in some cultures and some societies, and so are women. And there are all sorts of reasons that are given for the act of circumcision and why it's practiced in some cultures and not in other cultures. And it's very controversial, especially in regard to women, because it is said to have strong impacts on their sexual experience and potential for sexual experience. But one of the things, and it may be doing other things as well, that circumcision does is it generates ceremonies of difference. That is a way in which everyone learns that what we've got is a male versus everyone learns that what we've got is a female. And there are specific ceremonial apparatuses that reinforce, that recognize, that celebrate, as you're doing the mutilation itself, that celebrate with feasts and all sorts of things, the mutilation that has occurred. And that is a very odd thing if we think what people are doing is celebrating the mutilation. But they're not. They're celebrating the classification and the fact that we don't have a boy, we have a girl. And in some cultures, we have a girl, we don't have a boy. Then that stands for those things. Now, this notion that that's the way you do it is only one way of doing it. And there are all sorts of other things, which I alluded to before, the dress, the naming, and all the rest of it, as well as theories of what it means for someone to be a boy or for a boy to be born as opposed to a girl. What's coming in this girl-boy difference, in this phenomenon of duck and bunny, and what is a duck's future compared to a bunny's future? And we have all sorts of notions in regard to sexuality per se. So in some places and sometimes in 19th century in Great Britain, the famous Victorian moment, there was a strong belief, and it carried over certainly to the United States, which has a similar culture derived from the British, that women have sometimes it was believed, have no capacity to enjoy sex. That sexuality is a man's thing, and certainly some people may have regarded it, I'm sure some people knew totally that was wrong, but some people indeed thought it is maybe not totally true, but that it is the case that men have a greater capacity for sex than do women. And some regard it as an impossibility, indeed, for women to enjoy a sexual life. It became, people grew somewhat in awareness that women did have some capacity for sexual response, but for long it was believed that women were not capable of orgasm. And that hung on longer than the idea that women did not experience any pleasure from sexuality. But what this sets up is this no orgasm, as well as even less capacity for pleasure and enjoyment, is that it creates a kind of passivity among women. And indeed, that's appropriate as well, because women are regarded, when they're normal, as being passive. That is normal to the classification, as being relative to men to be passive. As then it was regarded that women could indeed have orgasm, it was still thought that they could not have orgasm, certainly with each other, that you need to have a male, and that they certainly could not have an independent orgasm through masturbation, for example. Now, all of those ideas we know now are silly and ridiculous, but I bring them up because, of course, I'm always oriented toward things we now know are silly and ridiculous, because it gives us a clue that things which we think are true may also be silly and ridiculous about our own moment. And generations from now, people will be looking back and won't be able to believe the ridiculousness of people at NYU in the early 21st century. Well, if women are passive, we build on that passivity, and we do things like decorate them for their passivity. In China, we bind their feet. In the United States, we put them in high heels and tight clothing. It makes them less able to escape. It exaggerates the physical capacity differences between the envisioned strength of the male versus the weakness and dependency of the female. And this means that the females become decorative objects for the man because of the great bargain that's made. And the great bargain that's made, and radical feminists began this kind of an argument at least in the late 1950s, early 60s. I'm sure there were threads of it going on before. The great bargain is that men get the favor of sex from women. Women, in return, get the name of the man. And it isn't just like some of you will make the choice whether to take your husband's name or not to take your husband's name on who knows what criteria. In the olden days, you had to take their name, not just because it was the law or enshrined in practice, but because that's your ticket to a life, because your capacity to get credit when that came around and became appropriate, the capacity to be cared for in a larger kin group, the capacity to be recognized at church as a legitimate person, the appropriateness for having children, all of this depended upon the marriage and, to a good extent, taking the name. We now have much discussion about whether gay people, would that really be marriage? In those days, if a woman didn't take the name, that wouldn't really be marriage. It's a complete, total deal, and it's part of the deal, including protection from other men. And so the basis for anger, revenge, prosecution in law is when your woman has been approached sexually or raped, and that word then comes into use, by another man. So your husband is your protection, your provider from the visitations and the offenses, including calling out in the street, but of course also forcing sexuality on a woman. The way the radical feminists used to put it is that all men are pimps, basically. That the husband's role is the same as a pimp. Offers protection, and if there's money, inherits the money, takes the dowry, and provides a protection for the woman. Well, this deal that's set up also sets up pathologies. And so a labeling apparatus gets going for women who, in effect, choose the wrong door, in some sense, in some way, even some small way. So a woman who is a woman is open to disgrace if she doesn't get a man, and more or less a befitting man of her social class and race. A disgrace, especially then if she has a child without getting marriage. The child is illegitimate and she is illegitimate. She is a prostitute, she is a whore, and she is accessible to virtually any man without the protection of a man. And that means that prosecuting someone for rape who has had sexual intercourse with a woman of loose morals, as is evidenced by her having an illegitimate child, but even just the reputation of not saving it for the man and engaging in sex exclusively with her husband, it is very difficult, it was very difficult to prosecute such a person. Because in fact, he's taking nothing. It was already taken, that which he took. And so therefore, it was just out there and ready. The woman who is seductive and acting like she's interested in having sex with a man is asking for it. And that made it also harder to prosecute people for sex crimes like rape. And I'm not making this up. This was actually given as evidence in courts that a particular woman had been seductive, which then would justify this kind of event. That women were labeled, if they showed that they were interested in sex and indeed enjoyed it during these periods when they weren't supposed to, as part of her sexuality, a part of her gender, that she wasn't supposed to show it, then a person who does that is clinically suspect. And the word was used when I was young, nymphomania. A woman who likes sex the way a man does is a nymphomaniac. And when I was growing up, we talked about it. That is, we would identify, we would hear that certain girls were nymphs, and that meant they were open season. And of course, it was very exciting and a wonderful thing. But you would never, of course, take that girl then seriously as a possible mate or a date to the prom. That would be the last thing you do. And then there is the other classification of hysteria. That is, a woman who finds this bargain, this set of roles, as somehow something that she doesn't enjoy and doesn't like, that is, in effect, living through her husband. Then psychiatrists use the word hysteria often, sometimes at least, to label this woman as having a clinical problem. And one of the great breakthroughs of modern feminism, in the words of Betty Friedan, whose name I think I've given you in the past, Friedan, Betty Friedan called it the problem with no name, that women are very unhappy, and what is it called? And as I said, one pejorative that was used was hysteria, but for Betty Friedan, it was more like sexism, and that something needed to be done so that there would be a change in how things work. Well, that change, of course, has happened. Women are now more sexually active. It is not a scandal. They are enjoy sexuality with themselves, sometimes with other women. They live lives of singleness in a way that didn't used to be the case. And many women have their children and raise them without the family name or even without marriage itself bestowed on them from other men. And when they have sex with men, they don't necessarily and automatically assume the so-called missionary position, which is one that simulates submission. And so there's a new kind of bargain, if that's what it is. And I think we're all sort of working out in part exactly what that new bargain is that replaces the old one. But we know it has other characteristics besides the sexual positions that people are in. It means that women have careers, that women have jobs, that all sorts of doors that were considered automatically closed are now open. And so there's then this way in which, you see what I've tried to do, is go the whole route from the body and its sexual experience and what people imagine that sexual experience to be, whether it's correct or it's incorrect, the labeling system of women and their sexuality, how that then spins off to the kind of gender relations that people have with other men and with men, and then the kind of structural consequences there are in terms of employment, job markets, and opportunities for alternative ways of doing it. Well, enough about the women. Let's talk about the men, because I know quite a few of you have that as your gender preference. And let's just talk about that. So I think we all know the stereotype that comes with that package of the male birth, that this is going to be someone active in the world, that compared to women it's going to be an aggressive human being, quite forceful, responsible, powerful, and will therefore and appropriately make more money and take on jobs that have greater capacity, and get themselves a honey babe to be their very own. And, I meant to show you this. This is Lucille Ball, always trying to act like a man. The series really revolves around her trying to do things in the world, and it always falls apart. And that's what the comedy is. And she's truly a brilliant comic, and the people who wrote for her were truly brilliant. But it rests on that supposition that it's a hopeless cause, and there's no way is it going to work. This is, of course, a honey, and this is Elizabeth Taylor. She's in her 60s when this picture is taken. But of course, they honeyed this picture up with all the technology that was available then. I had a friend, I actually saw the pre-fixed up picture of Elizabeth Taylor because I have a friend who worked as a retoucher. There was no Photoshop, so that they actually had to paint directly on the negative. And out of that, the Elizabeth Taylor that you see, he did this very one. He was Elizabeth Taylor's retoucher. And she's just a gorgeous creature. And of years ago, she's gorgeous that in a way that we don't do quite gorgeous anymore. In that, first of all, she's got quite a bit of cleavage. And that was quite ideal in the 50s and the 60s. And she's got that pouting, dreamy-eyed look, which I think also, going by the Calvin Klein posters that I see outside my building, 4 stories tall, I think it's a little more steely now. Reflecting, I think, some of these things that I've said. I mean, she is ready for the missionary position now, isn't she? And I think she had 5 husbands, Elizabeth Taylor. I know I'm looking at you. My authority on this matter is Zalman. I don't know. Does anybody know? Who's a Hollywood aficionado here? Okay, that could be on the midterm. We did the midterm already. 8. We have got 8. Anybody give me 9? Oh, give me 9. Okay, she had quite a few husbands, and that, of course, was suspect as well. But we made a special exception for Hollywood, and they had to. Isn't it interesting? It's sort of tedious. Get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced. I mean, why not just sin? And you save yourself all that aggravation and so much Tupperware that you don't have to open and look excited about. Now here's one where I actually get to show you the real thing. So this is a model. I think it might be Catherine Deneuve. Is it Catherine Deneuve? Has anybody ever heard of Catherine Deneuve? Yes. Is it? You don't think so? Okay. And it's not Indira Gandhi, but there it is after it's been fixed and put into ad copy. So I'll just show you that again. So she's a perfectly attractive woman, but that's not going to be enough. And so that's the way she's then touched up and transformed. I don't know if transformed is the right word, but modified. And as many critics point out, this is not only a construction of gender, which it is. The retouching on men, would look different because women are supposed to be perfect in this kind of way, with no lines in their face, no evident texture in their skin. Men can have texture, and indeed are supposed to have texture. So what we've done is we have perfected femaleness in the Photoshop moment. This was also not Photoshop. This is from the same guy in the old days who I was speaking about before, that we don't let it stand like this. And it also means, and the critics of advertising point this out many, many times, you've all heard it, is that it creates an unrealistic a goal for any woman. To be a woman, to be an appropriate sex object, to be ready for the deal that I spoke of before. You have to look like this, but you can't look like this. Only people in the Photoshop look like this. And this one is actually part of my news series. This is actually a news photo that ran very briefly, and it was very odd. This is a beauty contest. And what's happened is that a bee has come along. And this beauty woman right here is completely freaked out. And some people are afraid of bees, and I don't like bees either. But what I want to show you is how unbeautiful she looks. And the media cooperate with beauty queens by, it's like the Iwo Jima rule, by clinging to the ones that most polish off the idea of a beauty queen. That what we have here is a flawless beauty queen of the quasi, as much as possible, like the Elizabeth Taylor version that I showed you a few moments ago. And these are constrained and contained because, like Diane Hagman would say, it destroys the whole idea of a beauty contest. And the news show is about great beauty and the greatest beauties of all being assembled in the great competition of beauty, of female beauty, of women's beauty. And anything that deranges that is screwing up the whole game for everybody else. Wow. I promised you that it was going to get exciting. And next time, by the way, you should come to class because I've got even more exciting stuff for you. But this is one of our great famous painters. 1866 is when this was painted, Gustave Courbet. And of course, this is a knockout phenomenon of two women in what I think I can only see as a sexual embrace. At the time, that was less obvious because anything like lesbianism was so unimaginable that these must have been sisters who are getting ready for church or something, having a little get together while they think about things. What, of course, I want to show you is how much they vary from Elizabeth Taylor. We've got fat. That's what we've got. And again, Calvin Klein. Can you imagine putting this up on Houston Street and try to sell anything with this stuff? No way. This is of a particular moment. And what I'm trying to get across with this, again, I don't think this will be a foreign notion to most of you, is that the notion of what is this princess, this gorgeousness creature, changes historically. And culturally. So there's nothing intrinsic about it. That's a bit controversial. Some people say there's some aspects of beauty, like big eyes, for example. In pets, people like big-eyed pets, and they've been bred to be that way. And that seems to be across time. But this tells us that it's not just about universals, that something indeed changes over time. And I'll just race you through some of the other masterworks. These are all big brand names, okay, of idealizations of women. This woman has not been to the gym, and we've got some issues here, don't we? And here we have three of them. And this is now shameful in our culture. And indeed, we have gyms. And so what is going on with these people? And what's going on is they're living in a different moment and having a different set of sensibilities that they are catering to of gender and of sexuality. And this is one of the great figures of late 19th century American entertainment. Do you know who this is? It's Rosalind Russell, who was considered, she's the, I don't know anybody, who's a sex symbol now? Who's a big woman? Who do we just love? I don't know, I don't pay attention. Kate Moss. Wasn't she a model, or isn't she a model? Yeah, she's still really big as a model, and she's the essence of beauty. Okay, let's use Kate Moss, who I don't have a slide of, but I don't have a picture in my mind of what Kate Moss looks like, but it's not this. Not this at all. And she was the star of the New York stage, Rosalind Russell, at the time. Well, I think it's time for me to stop these slides and go on to say a few more things about men before we, it's very polished and sophisticated, before we go on. Because there is an analogous series of things to say about men. I don't have any slides, but I could show you what the idealized man looked like, say 50 years ago when Elizabeth Taylor was in her prime, or Marilyn Monroe. Has anybody ever heard of Bing Crosby? Yeah, everybody has. Do you know what he looked like? Do you know what he looked like? He wasn't much to look at, but he always got the girl. And he always got the girl because in Hollywood land, you didn't have to look like a handsome guy to get the Hollywood girl. First of all, they would protect the men by never actually showing their bodies. So they would always be in suit jackets that would obscure what was going on, and their lack of strength, and a kind of seeing men who were obviously not very strong as somehow still having great power, as somehow having great strength, in a way that I think we don't allow that anymore. Brad Pitt, who I don't have a picture of, Brad Pitt is supposed to be the strong guy, and Brad Pitt is a strong guy. He does go to the gym in a way that Clark Gable and Bing Crosby and these other guys didn't do it. But they are, and this is then the package that comes with birth, active in the world, aggressive, forceful, I think I gave you the list, responsible, powerful, and entitled to higher wages rather than the lower wages that, of course, would come with women's work, the higher wages that would come with man's work. And in terms of sexuality, none of this business about no orgasm, no capacity to enjoy sex, being passive, none of that, incapable of independent orgasm, none of that for men. Men are, if anything, 24/7 erection stags. And what we have to therefore do is protect women from them. And that's one of the reasons why we have separate women's spaces, and especially in the 19th century. It wasn't just separate men's and women's rooms, but separate parlors for men and separate parlors for women, separate cars on the trains for women compared to men. In the library, there were women's reading rooms and men's reading rooms. You had to do all you could to keep these people separate because of the passion of the men that would jump over the hurdle, out of the pen and into the woman. And that's why you needed to create these separations wherever you can. And there were pathologies that went along with men who were not comfortable or who didn't bring that off for one reason or another. And when you read the poetry that men wrote at the time being, I'm now thinking about the 19th century, if you read the poetry that men were writing and the memoirs, it seems clear to me that some men, at least, were actually ill-fitted to this mode of life, were actually sensitive, aware of other people, and were struggling to accommodate the social definition of their role. If they didn't do this so well because of these proclivities, they were again labeled with other pathologies that fit their circumstance. So they were effeminate, which wasn't just a description, but was a category of male that is very worrisome. That they were weak, that they were girlish. All of these were pathologies to be overcome. And parents especially worried about their sons, that they were headed in this direction. And one of the things that athletics was supposed to do, including the invention of whole new sports. So I've just been reading about the French skiers. The French didn't know how to ski at all. And one of the reasons why France took up skiing and became, especially when the Olympics, the modern Olympics were developed, was it was thought that skiing would be a way of overcoming the effeteness that France's leaders were worried that French men had compared to, for example, Norwegian men or Canadian men or American men who were more virile. And this incapacity to be strong and virile would leave France weak on the world stage and militarily weak. And France created not only the sport of skiing in France, it had already existed in other countries, but created a military unit of French skiers. That is, they skied with armaments, and that was also reproduced in other parts of Europe around the Alps. So you had to do something about it. And of course, if you carried this into homosexuality or anything resembling it, that's a kind of sickness, a perversion, and we'll talk more about that next time, as evidence of a crime against humanity. And all of these things are crimes against classification. I mean, that's another way to talk about it. They are eroding that classification in various ways. Most recently, those people who take this strong position of gender, men are strong and women are weak, when the AIDS epidemic, and some people in the Christian right proposed the idea that it was God's revenge against gay men. And one way of thinking about that, and and they sometimes indeed spoke of it almost this way, is that they have betrayed the gender role. And all men who do the much more subtle things of putting the pinky up when they drink not coffee but tea, and that they show effeminacy or whatever, are traitors to the cause. This whole bargain, this whole deal, this whole classification system that I've built up over today's class is being threatened. So, what's happened since? Well, again, you all know I don't want to just sing Kumbaya with you and talk about all the great advances we've made. But indeed, men can be weaker. They can be sensitive, weaker in quotes. We also know that strength and weakness don't come in a John Wayne form, that some of us are called to do some of the most courageous things in the world, which would be called feminine, but involve the greatest of courage. And women have shown that on, and now men show that kind of courage as well. And they exert care of babies. I just find it astonishing, as I'm in airports, for example, these days, to watch men and their babies and the kind of vulnerability that they display and tenderness toward their infants is just, again, I testify to you that in my lifetime, that would have been inconceivable, say, 40 years ago. And it was inconceivable not because in any strong, clear way men were incapable of that, but they were incapable of it, just as they're incapable of walking through the women's room door as in, say, an academic building. They were, it would not only expose their vulnerability, but expose their betrayal of the role. And I have a lot of autobiographical evidence for that, that it becomes a serious offense to exhibit these kinds of traits years ago when I was young. And that has changed. And of course, in sexuality, it has also changed. So men also can have headaches at the moment of that sex is proposed to them and not want to do it because they're not indeed 24/7 gangbusters. And they can also have a lot of fun masturbating, just like women. And they can be, at least in some parts of the world and some neighborhoods in the world, they can even be gay. So all of that's going on. Well, what is at stake, and what have I been talking about all of today's lecture, and then what is coming in the next sequence when we meet again on Thursday, and what's the tip-off here? Well, I've brought it up again and again, that sometimes the term is used, a Procrustean bed, it doesn't matter about the term, that what these classifications do, and today we've talked about gender classifications based on that plumbing that we start off with, but which society does all kinds of funny things with, that this classification, we're back to the problem of ducks and bunnies. And unlike the duck and bunny distinction, these distinctions matter a lot in terms of how people are going to carry on their life. And that what society is about, what history is about, what the structuration process is about, is often to make things of that biological difference, to make other differences come alive, and harden it. That a duck cannot be a bunny, it cannot be anything like a bunny, and a bunny cannot be anything like a duck. Big stakes. And the reason why they're big stakes is that I've been obviously trying to argue that these classifications are suspect. I did it through historical examples. I do it by referring to contemporary examples. It's suspect to think that there is a necessity between these biological diagnosis and the lives that people are somehow required to live, that society intervenes in a major way. But we can understand, starting with the duck-bunny business, we can understand that there are very large stakes beyond sexuality and beyond gender, because it threatens or has consequence or implications for the way we think. And now we're back to this problem about how natives think. It's how we think. We're natives. All of us are natives. Not just us, not just the Hawaiians, but we're all natives. And we think in terms of distinctions and classifications. The only way we have a way to think, to introspect, to follow George Herbert Mead, to follow Irving Goffman's ideas of what we're all doing all the time, is that we are manipulating symbols. Those symbols rest on words. Words are based on distinctions. I've got a duck, I've got a bunny. I've got a boy, I've got a girl. We have to make distinctions. We have to make classifications. And once we get differences going in a certain direction, it becomes difficult to alter them. And so the institutions of society, in a way that I've treated the 19th century, which was more varied than I made it out to be, and certainly on a world scale was very different than the way the Victorians were doing it within Great Britain, that they insist on it. They start scaring up these variations and insist that it has to be total, a perfect version, so that we don't have to doubt that the classification is viable and right. So do you see where I'm going with this? If someone were to come along and say everything you know is wrong, to say that all the classifications in your brain about what is a chair and what is a table and what is a stage and what is a professor and what is a student, that, wait a minute, you're just operating with stereotypes. There's actually much more variation than you're making it out to be, and you should just, in fact, try to just get over it and get past those distinctions and stop thinking in terms of these classifications that you have, or indeed, the most radical claim, classifications at all. Well, if someone says that to you, you are threatening their capacity to be in the world in the most radical way possible. There goes thinking, for example, having a future, having a past, having a self, all washed away. So when someone approaches that kind of threat with a classification that has been treated as fundamental, which sex and gender are treated as fundamental, then that is a big worry. And that's why making change over history is rocky and difficult, but as we know, it can happen. That is, people can operate with agency. They can rebel in the Stonewall Bar here on Sheridan Square and walk a path that invites other people to walk the same path. They do. It's encouraging. A social movement happens, and a new structure comes into being. See ya.